Hey guys, hope you've had a good weekend. I was hoping that we would be getting back to school sooner than what we're going to be. I'm hoping that we will get to come back on April the 20th, but I guess we'll see. Um, Please let me know if you have any questions. If there's anything that you need from me, I'm here to help you. All you have to do is email me. You can post a comment on Google Classroom if you have a problem or need help. Um, please don't hesitate to reach out to me with any issues that you have, because most of this stuff that we're doing is especially when it comes to the assignments, are new. On Google Classroom, I had all this stuff pencil paper, but I did not have it on Google Classroom, so it's very possible that I could mess something up. I could put something on there that you would that wouldn't open for you. I could make any kind of mistake possible. So please let me know if there's anything that you have a question about so that I can take care of it, because you're probably not the only one that has the question. Like I said, this is the first time I've put it on Google Classroom, and so there's definitely probably going to be kinks and stuff in it. I haven't got all of your stuff graded from last week yet. I know that I got your entrance and exit slips and quizzes graded because I wanted to get those graded and back to you before you took the exam on Thursday, so that you would know any mistakes that you made, and you could ask any questions about it that you needed to before the exam. I have not graded the exams yet. I've looked at them a little bit, but that's it. The last time I looked, everyone hadn't even completed it yet, so I will get those graded and back to you. Also, the assignments that I graded last week, I wasn't able to put them in Infinite Campus yet because the grading window for first timers was open until Friday, and so I wasn't able to access second 9 weeks. At least I don't think I was. Anyway, so I put the grades, but I put them on Google Classroom, but I did not put them in Infinite Campus. So my plans are this week to go back and add all the grades from the stuff that you did last week, because that stuff is for second 9 weeks, and also to get your exams graded and get those back to you and put those grades in Infinite Campus as well. Generally, I try to do a little bit of a curve on the exam, and so my plan is to still do that, unless we have 100. If we have 100, then I won't do that, but as long as there's not 100, I will put some curve, and it will say that on Infinite Campus. Normally on Infinite Campus, I put how much the curve was, so it will be on Infinite Campus, but if you don't see it or can't find it or still have questions, you can email me and I will tell you. So we finished up with muscles last week, and you should have completed your handout for lab exercises 12 and 13 on Thursday and Friday, after the exam Thursday, and then on Friday as well. And you will be having a quiz over lab exercises 12 and 13. Let me see here. On Thursday this week. Again, these lesson plans are posted on Google Classroom. If you haven't seen those, I plan on spending 3 days this week on Chapter 11, which is just general information about the nervous system, nervous tissue. The rest of this semester, we will be working on the nervous system. I know in the syllabus, I had only 2 days for the nervous or Chapter 11, and then I think I had 2 or 3 days for Chapter 12, and I think I'm going to reverse that and do 3 days for Chapter 11 and maybe only 2 days for Chapter 12. We'll see. And then after, you will have a lab quiz on Thursday over lab exercises 12 and 13, and then you will do lab exercise 14, and then on Friday you will be doing lab exercise 15. Again, we are going to be doing all of these just with diagrams again. And then we would have a quiz over lab exercises 14 and 15 would be next Thursday, I guess. You'll also have on Monday next week a quiz over Chapter 11. So again, a quiz this week, another quiz next week on Monday over Chapter 11, and then another quiz next Thursday over lab exercises 14 and 15. You can look on your syllabus to see when a lab exam will be coming up. I think it's going to be maybe middle of April, maybe after spring break, but I won't swear to that, so look on your syllabus to be sure. And let me know if you have any questions about anything that we're doing so far. So anyway, we are going to be looking at Chapter 11 today. We're going to go through the first 10 or 11 learning targets in Chapter 11. So again, looking at nerve tissue. A lot of this information, not all of it, but some of this information we actually talked about last year in regular anatomy. The nervous system, we know, helps us to sense our environment and respond to our environment. It also regulates and coordinates the functions of our body that help us to maintain homeostasis. So not only is our nervous system helping us to sense and respond to our environment, external environment, but it also allows our body to sense and respond to the internal environment to help us to maintain homeostasis. So, it helps to keep it helps to regulate your heartbeat. It helps to regulate your breathing. It helps to regulate your blood vessel constriction and dilation, your erector pili muscles. So not just external input and output, but also internal input and output. There are two main types of cells in the nervous system. We talked about this last year in regular anatomy, neurons, and we call them neuroglia. In this class, we just call them glial cells, okay? So just glia or glial cells instead of a neuroglia. It's the same thing. The neurons, remember, are like the kings. They are the ones that are actually conducting the electrical signals, so they are electrically excitable cells. And we've already talked about the structure of a neuron more than once in this class. We also did in our regular anatomy last year as well, so we will look at that again briefly. And then we're going to see, again, remember those glial cells are neuroglia, are supporting cells. They help to protect the neuron, nourish the neuron, repair the neuron. We're going to see in this class now that they are supportive cells, but they do several different things, but we're going to actually give them names. And we're going to see that there are different types of glial cells in the central nervous system as compared to the peripheral nervous system. We're also going to look at a few terms that we will be using again and again in the next 4 or 5 chapters that we'll be doing. First of all, a nerve. What actually is a nerve? Well, a nerve is a bundle of axons outside the brain and spinal cord. So remember that the axon is the kind of like the wire of the neuron, and we'll look at that again here in a minute. But basically, it's the part that actually conducts the action potential or the electrical signal. And what we see now is that a nerve is a bundle of axons. So we have lots of neurons. Their axons are bundled together into what we call a nerve, and this is going to be any bundle of axons outside the brain and spinal cord. And again, they do conduct electricity. Those axons are the structures of the neurons that conduct the electrical signals. So again, the nerves are the axons conducting the electrical signal to and from the brain and spinal cord. Again, from your body to your brain and spinal cord, and then from your brain and spinal cord back to your body. There are two different kinds of nerves. We have cranial nerves, and we talked about these in regular anatomy last year as well. There are 12 pair of those, and they actually branch off of your brain, so they are called cranial nerves. We talked about these, if you remember, on Old Olympus, towering tops of Finn and German viewed some hops. That was the mnemonic that we used to remember those 12 pair of cranial nerves, and we will be learning that and having to know those 12 pair of cranial nerves and their names again, but you are going to have to know more than just the name and whether they are sensory or motor as far as function goes. You're also going to have to be more specific and know the actual function of those. The other nerves are called spinal nerves, and they branch off of the spinal cord, and there are 31 pairs of those. Now, we are going to learn a few of those spinal nerves, but we're not going to learn the names of all of them or anything like that. Okay, a couple of other terms besides a nerve. A ganglion. Remember that neurons also have cell bodies, and when we have a cluster of cell bodies outside the brain and spinal cord, we call that the ganglion. So you're going to have a ganglion that connects to a nerve. The nerve is the cluster of the axons, and then the ganglion is the cluster of the cell bodies from those axons. And then we have a plexus. A plexus is actually a bundle of nerves. So a nerve is a bundle of axons. A plexus is a bundle of nerves outside the brain and spinal cord. So when you think of a plexus, just think of a lot of nerves, a bundle of nerves together. And we'll talk about different plexuses as we go through the rest of these chapters this semester. So what does our nervous system do for us? Several things. We already talked about how it helps to regulate and coordinate different functions going on in our body, such as our heart cells beating together, and so it helps us maintain homeostasis. It also helps us to receive sensory input. So again, as I said earlier, it not only monitors conditions outside your body and helps you respond to those, it also monitors internal body conditions as well. So getting information not only from your five senses, but also things internally to help you maintain homeostasis, like the pH of your blood pressure, all those good things. So that would be more of the sensory function that we talked about last year in regular anatomy. The integrative function, that's what we're talking about here, integrating information. So when we talk about integrating information, this is where your brain, the information from your body comes in through your spinal cord and your nerves to your brain, and then your brain decides what to do. So it processes that sensory information, it processes the information coming in, and then initiates responses and decides what to do with it. And a lot of times it's the brain processing that, but sometimes, guys, it never even goes to the brain. It goes to the spinal cord and then right back out to the body. These are going to be things like your reflexes, an automatic involuntary response to a stimulus. So again, that the spinal cord is responsible for some of the reflexes that we're talking about there. You know, sometimes that sensory information, that input information doesn't even go all the way up to your brain. When we need an immediate response, that information will go to our spinal cord and then directly back out to our body to respond to that stimulus without the information even going to our brain. So the brain does a lot of the integrative function, but the spinal cord also does some of that as well. And then this number 4 is going to be your response. Okay, so we have a sensory function, we have an integrative function, and then we have a motor function. So the sensory function is where we sense our internal and external environment. The integrative function, integrating the information, that's when our brain and spinal cord decide. They process that information and decide how we should respond. And then number 4 is the response. We call it the motor function, where our brain and spinal cord control all of our responses, not only the responses of our skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle, but also glands. Our brain and spinal cord help to regulate and initiate contraction of all the different types of muscles in our body. And we'll see more how our nervous system is divided. We have actually a branch of our peripheral nervous system that controls the skeletal muscle, the voluntary part of it, and then we have another branch that controls the involuntary. Mainly they're going to be the smooth muscle, because we know our heart is not controlled. It can be affected by our nervous system, but not controlled by it. So mainly it can have an effect on our heartbeat, but definitely controlling the contraction of that smooth muscle. And then, of course, our brain is also responsible for our mental activity, our thinking, our memory, our emotion, and our consciousness is there in the brain. And when we talk about the brain, we'll do a whole chapter over the brain, and we'll talk about a bunch of the different parts of the brain and some of these different functions that those parts have, not only in regulating responses, but also in our memory and our emotion and our thinking. Okay, so this is a really good visual that shows us the divisions of the nervous system, and then we'll talk about each one of these a little bit more individually. We will actually do a whole chapter just on the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the peripheral nervous system, which are divisions actually of the autonomic nervous system, which is then division of the peripheral nervous system. So again, you can actually take whole classes over these different parts. So we'll do a chapter, I think, just over the spinal cord, one just over the brain, and then we'll do another chapter just over the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and I think we'll do a chapter over the autonomic and somatic. So I mean, we've got about 4 or 5 more chapters to go, and they will be just on different parts of this graphic right here. So again, the central nervous system consists of our brain and spinal cord, and then the other part is the peripheral nervous system, and that consists of all of the nerves, the ganglia, and the I guess, plexuses and all that good stuff. Also, your cranial and spinal nerves are all part of this peripheral nervous system. So these are the two main divisions of your nervous system: the central nervous system, composed of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, composed of the cranial and spinal nerves, all of the nerves, the ganglia and all that. And then we see our peripheral nervous system is further subdivided into a sensory division and a motor division. So the sensory division, again, these are going to be our sensory neurons. These are the neurons that are carrying information from our body to our brain, receiving information from all of the different sensory receptors, whether they be pressure receptors in our blood vessels or whether they be pressure receptors in our skin, helping us to sense our external environment. Also, sensory receptors in your eyes, in all your five senses, your eyes, your ears, your nose, your mouth, your skin, all are going to be connected to nerves that are part of the sensory division. And then the other division is the motor division, and this is going to be composed of motor neurons. Again, this is the sensory function. Our central nervous system integrates, and then the motor function is once our central nervous system decides what to do, then that information will be sent along the motor neurons. So the motor neurons are the motor division of the peripheral nervous system, and basically the central nervous system receives the information from the sensory division, and then it puts out information through the motor division to tell our body how to respond to the information that we received from our sensory division. We can further subdivide the motor division into the autonomic and somatic nervous system. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the somatic is going to be the branch of the peripheral nervous system that controls our skeletal muscle, our voluntary muscles. And then the autonomic division is going to be the division that controls our involuntary muscle. It affects the cardiac muscle, and then it controls the smooth muscle. And then of that autonomic division, we have two further divisions. We have the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. The sympathetic division is responsible for your fight or flight response. And then your parasympathetic division is responsible for your rest and digest response. And we talked about those some last year in regular anatomy, and we will be going into those again in this class. So again, I've already went over a lot of this, so this is all just review, but you do have it not only in picture form in this diagram, but you also have it in word form here as well. So again, the two main subdivisions of the nervous system are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of our brain and spinal cord, and it receives information from our body, and then it also sends information as far as for a response to our body. The peripheral nervous system consists of nerves that are going to be not only detecting stimuli within and outside your body and sending it to our central nervous system, but also then sending information from our central nervous system to our body to respond to that information from the sensory division. So again, not only does it consist of sensory receptors, ganglia, and nerves, it also is going to contain those motor neurons as well. And again, is divided into sensory and motor divisions. So again, here is a overall view of the nervous system of the two branches. The central nervous system being our brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system containing the cranial nerves, all the spinal nerves branching off the spinal cord. In addition, the ganglia, which remember are the clusters of cell bodies that are outside the central nervous system. Here's another visual that kind of shows you the flow of information. So here we have input from our environment or from the inside of our body. It could be light, sound, taste, touch, smell, temperature, pain, pressure. It can be pain within our body. It can be blood pH we could have here. We could have pressure receptors in our blood vessels. We could have all different kinds of input here. And these are all sent along these sensory receptors to our central nervous system, our brain and spinal cord. So this is the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system, containing those sensory nerves, sending information to our brain and spinal cord, which is our central nervous system. The central nervous system then receives that information, processes it, integrates it, and then decides what our response should be. And then the central nervous system sends that response out through the autonomic and somatic nervous system. The response as far as somatic nervous system goes to the effectors are our skeletal muscles, so this determines how we're going to move and respond to that information that was sent into our central nervous system. And then the autonomic nervous system regulates our involuntary muscles. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions both, again, this is fight or flight, this is rest and digest. The effectors here, cardiac and smooth muscle, as well as glands. So, when let's say we detect that there is a mean dog after us. Okay, so we hear the loud barking. And so the sound comes in through our sensory receptors and our sensory nerves to our brain and spinal cord. Our brain and spinal cord say, hey man, we've got to get out of here. We are going to be in fight or flight mode. So it sends signals to our somatic nervous system, which activates our skeletal muscles to start running. It also sends information to our autonomic nervous system, and we're in this fight or flight mode. So our sympathetic division is going to be in control here. Our heart is going to speed up. Our breathing is going to speed up. Our salivary glands and our digestive organs are going to slow down. It's going to inhibit our digestive and our urinary systems because we're not worried about eating or being hungry or going to the bathroom. We're worried about getting the heck out of Dodge. And so we're going to inhibit this secretion of the glands in our digestive tract, the pancreas and all of the mucus secreting glands and things like that. And this is going to allow us to run and have the energy and the breathing and the heart rate that, get the oxygen that we need to our cells, to our skeletal muscle cells, to give them extra strength to run and get the heck out of Dodge so we can get away from that dog that's fixing to bite us. Okay, so again, the divisions of the peripheral nervous system. The sensory receptors are going to detect the stimuli. They would be detecting the loud sound of the dog barking, and they would send that along sensory nerves to our central nervous system. Again, sensory nerves then are going to be transmitting information from our body to our central nervous system. Again, there are specialized receptor cells in our body that kind of take in that information and then send it along these sensory nerves to our brain and spinal cord. So again, that sensory information that's being taken in by those receptors and sent along those sensory nerves could be information about pain, temperature, pressure, smell, light, sound, all that good stuff. And then after our brain and spinal cord process that information, they do that integrative function, they send that information about how we need to respond back out along our motor neurons. So motor neurons are going to be transmitting information away from the brain and spinal cord, the central nervous system, to our effector organs. Could be not only our skeletal muscles, but also our smooth muscle, our cardiac muscle, and glands. And again, the somatic is going to be more responsible for sending it to skeletal muscle, and then the autonomic is going to be more responsible for sending it to our smooth muscle, our cardiac muscle, and our glands. Again, the somatic nervous system is voluntary. It controls our voluntary muscles. So again, information is being sent from our central nervous system to our skeletal muscle through the nerves of our somatic nervous system, and then information is being sent from our brain and spinal cord to our smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands along nerves of that autonomic nervous system. Again, so the autonomic is more responsible for the involuntary. And hold on just a minute because I need to check. I just got a message from someone and I don't want to not be able to answer any question that they have. Okay, that's nothing. I don't have to worry about that. Sorry. Okay, anyway, the autonomic nervous system, and we'll see this, guys, later on. This will be very important to us later on, so I want to kind of go ahead and stress it to you now, is that it's a little bit different from that somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system actually uses 2 neurons to get information from the brain to the effector organs, to the smooth muscle and the glands. So again, our somatic nervous system is only going to use 1 neuron to get information from our brain and spinal cord to our skeletal muscle. But with our autonomic nervous system, we use 2 neurons. There's 1 neuron that goes directly from the brain or spinal cord to a ganglion, and then a second neuron that goes from the ganglion to the effector organ or gland. So it's a 2 neuron system there. And that's all we're going to say about it for now, but it is something that I want to stress to you because it's going to come back up again whenever we do our chapter over the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. We're actually going to compare and contrast the two. And that's going to be a big difference. Not only the fact that somatic controls the voluntary skeletal muscles and the autonomic controls involuntary muscle, and glands. Is going to be the difference in the number of neurons. So there's only one neuron that leads directly from the brain or spinal cord to the muscle, the skeletal muscle, but there's two neurons that lead from the brain and spinal cord to the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. These are called effector organs. Okay, again, there are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. We'll also talk about another called the enteric, but we won't talk a lot about that. The main two we'll talk about are the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Again, the sympathetic prepares the body for physical activity. Again, that is your fight or flight response. And then the parasympathetic regulates your body when you are resting. Allowing you to digest food, go to the bathroom, and things like that. We call that the rest and digest response. And then again, that enteric nervous system is going to be your own set of nerves, of plexuses that are associated with your digestive tract. So your digestive system has its own branch of the nervous system. Okay, so looking at the cells of the nervous system, first of all, we estimate that there are about 100 billion neurons in your body, with most of those being in your brain and spinal cord. It's really crazy. And then our glial cells, which remember are those supporting cells, account for over half of your brain's weight. So over half of your brain is made up of those supporting cells. Those we'll see here in a little bit. Ependymal cells, astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, and microglial cells. Those are the glial cells that are found in our central nervous system. So those would be the one that make up over half of our brain's weight. So again, before we look at the glial cells more closely, let's look at the neurons. Remember, neurons are electrically excitable cells of the nervous system. And there are three parts of the neuron. We learned about this last year in regular anatomy, and we've also looked about it in here. And I think you actually had a neuron that you had to label on your first lab exam. So remember, the cell body of the neuron, also called the soma, is where it's where all the normal stuff for that nerve cell is happening. So the protein synthesis is happening there. The mitochondria are going to be there. That's kind of just like the normal cell part of a neuron. It also has rough ER, which are able to synthesize significant amounts of protein. The rough ER, just like in our muscle cells, the endoplasmic reticulum, the ER, is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Well, in our neuron, it also has a special name. The rough ER is called Nissl bodies. Also, we have the dendrites. These are going to be the branches on the neuron that are receiving information from other neurons. And also, these are generally going to be very short and be highly branched, have lots of branches. And then the axon, remember we compared this to the wire of the nerve cell. It is going to be a lot longer than a dendrite. And we're going to look at some parts of the axon that we didn't talk about in regular anatomy. First off, we have the axon hillock. The axon hillock is the area that comes directly off of the cell body, so it's kind of cone-shaped. It's almost triangular in shape. And then beyond that axon hillock, we have something called the initial segment. The initial segment is the beginning of the axon. It contains not only the axon hillock, but the initial segment together. Those two things, the axon hillock and the initial segment, are called the trigger zone. And this is very important for us. You need to remember this for a little bit later on, like for tomorrow's lecture. Again, the initial segment is right after the axon hillock. It signals the beginning of the axon, and those two things together, the axon hillock and the initial segment, form the trigger zone. And the trigger zone is very important because this is where action potentials begin. This is where the action potential is generated. Some other things, again, remember our muscle cell had special names like sarcolemma, sarcoplasm. Well, so does our nerve cell. The cytoplasm inside the cell body is called the axoplasm, and then the cell membrane is called the axolemma. And then remember, at the end of the axon, we have the presynaptic terminals. Those are the little branches at the end of the neuron. And remember, we talked about these in our last chapter, in chapter 9, when we were talking about how the neuron stimulates the muscle cell. The presynaptic terminal was the end of the nerve cell. And it does contain synaptic vesicles full of a neurotransmitter. For muscle cells specifically, that neurotransmitter was ACH. So those little synaptic vesicles, those little sacs, contained the ACH, which was the neurotransmitter. Now, again, remember, ACH is not the only neurotransmitter, but it is the neurotransmitter that stimulates our skeletal muscle cells. And then remember, we also talked about the synapse, which is another name we said for in our chapter 9. Another name for the neuromuscular junction, where the neuron met the muscle cell. We call that the neuromuscular junction, but it can also be called a synapse. A synapse is the point of contact between an axon, between the ending of the axon, the presynaptic terminal, and then the postsynaptic membrane. Again, so the synapse is just where the neuron is going to be kind of meeting up with the other cell that it's going to stimulate. So that synapse could be a neuron meeting up with another neuron, or in our case in chapter 9, a neuron meeting up with a skeletal muscle cell. But neurons meet up with skeletal muscles, they meet up with smooth muscle, they meet up with glands, they meet up with other neurons. So there's several different things that this neuron could be meeting up with that we would call a synapse. Any of those would be called synapses. Okay, so again, here is our picture. This should look very familiar to you. Here's our cell body. Here we have our nucleus with the nucleolus, which is where the rRNA is being synthesized. Here we have our rough ER, which is our Nissl bodies. Here we have our axon hillock, again, kind of cone-shaped here. It is, the branching off of the cell body to where we go to the axon. And then here's our initial segment, and remember those two together are called the trigger zone. And so this area right in here is where the action potential actually begins. Then this whole part here is called the axon. Notice that the axon is surrounded by something that we call a Schwann cell. We'll learn more about those in a few minutes. But again, we're going to see here that a Schwann cell actually is responsible for synthesizing that myelin sheath, which we'll also talk more about here in a few minutes. And then here we see branches off of this axon. These are called our synaptic terminals or presynaptic terminals. And these would be the little branches that would be over here, would be contacting a muscle cell or another neuron, and there would be little vesicles of acetylcholine in these presynaptic terminals. We also see here something called a node of Ranvier. We're going to see that is a gap in the myelin sheath. So the myelin sheath is not continuous along this entire axon. There are individual little Schwann cells secreting that myelin sheath, and there are gaps between them. And those gaps are called nodes of Ranvier, and we'll talk more about the significance of those a little bit later, not today, but a little bit later. So we see that we can actually have things moving in two directions along that axon. Now, obviously, we don't want the action potential to move but just in one direction, away from the cell body toward the presynaptic terminals. However, other materials can move in either direction. In general, the axoplasm, which remembers the cytoplasm of the cell, is moved away from the cell body toward the synaptic terminals. This allows that cytoplasm, again, contains materials like nutrients and oxygen and things. So it provides materials that are needed for that axon, for that neuron, I should say, to grow, to repair. We also can have cytoskeletal proteins and organelles that move away from the cell body toward the synaptic terminals or the axon terminals. So again, cytoplasm carrying nutrients and oxygen, as well as organelles and proteins, like proteins at the cytoskeleton can move away from the cell body down the axon toward the synaptic terminals or axon terminals. But you can also have movement in the other direction. Now, you don't want action potentials moving in the other direction. Now, I'm not talking about action potentials here. I'm talking about other materials. Materials that can move actually the opposite direction toward the cell body are things like damaged organelles, also recycled plasma membrane, substances that are taken in by endocytosis. All of these things are transported up toward the cell body so that they can be recycled. They can be taken, they're taken up there and broken down and broken apart and either put out of the cell if it's something that the cell doesn't need, or reused, recycled inside the cell. Other things that can do this, rabies and herpes viruses can actually go into the axon and then be transported toward the cell body and actually up to the into the brain and spinal cord. Okay, because again, these cell bodies are going to be in the spinal cord in the brain. That's where they're going to be. So a rabies or herpes virus can actually go into the axon and can travel toward the cell body, opposite direction of an action potential, and go up to the cell body, which is in the brain and spinal cord. And this is how rabies and herpes can get into your central nervous system. Okay, now we're going to look at types of neurons. Again, we talked about these previously. Functional classifications are sensory, motor, and interneurons. And I'm going to go ahead and highlight this one too, just because I highlighted the other one, because I try to highlight the stuff that is important information, which most of this stuff is important information. So anyway, sensory neurons are going to be those neurons that are going to be carrying information from the body to the brain and spinal cord. So again, they're going to carry action potentials toward the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. They're going to carry stimuli from all 5 senses, as well as internal stimuli from inside your body, like if you have a headache or you're hungry or you're telling your brain that your blood pressure is high, or whatever the case may be. And then motor neurons are going to carry action potentials away from the brain and spinal cord toward your skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle, as well as glands. So again, this is our response to the stimuli. So once our brain and spinal cord decide our response, then the action potential sent from the brain and spinal cord will be carried to the skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle, as well as glands. And then we also have another kind of neuron. We talked about these last year in regular anatomy as well, called interneurons. The interneurons are in the brain and spinal cord only, and they basically carry information from one neuron to another. What we want to look at here, and I think we might have looked at this a little bit in regular anatomy, but not a whole lot. I think we watched a video maybe from Crash Course that talked about these, but I didn't really make you write anything down about them or ask you to know them, but you are going to have to know them for this class. The multipolar, bipolar, and pseudo-unipolar and anaxonic neurons. Multipolar have many dendrites and one axon. Most of our motor neurons are multipolar. So when we have been looking at a picture of a neuron, we have been looking at multipolar neurons, and your motor neurons are multipolar, and most of the neurons in your central nervous system and your brain and spinal cord are also multipolar. So multipolar neurons are a very common kind of neuron. Bipolar neurons are very rare. They are mainly in the retina of your eye and the sensory receptors in your nose. Those are the main 2 places you're going to find them, bipolar. And bipolar because they have 2. Again, multipolar means many processes or branches off of the cell body. Bipolar means 2, bis 2. 2 processes off the cell body. There's 1 dendrite and 1 axon. And then a unipolar or pseudo-unipolar have a single process off the cell body. So 1 branch off the cell body that then divides into 2, and most of your sensory neurons are this. So most sensory neurons are the unipolar or pseudo-unipolar. But now a few in your retina and your nose are bipolar. And then the last type of neuron is called an anaxonic neuron. And it is called anaxonic. Remember, an means without. Because it doesn't have an axon, it has only dendrites. These do not conduct action potentials. They're found mainly in your brain. And there are some also in your retina along with those bipolar. So here again is your multipolar. This is the one that we normally look at. These are probably the most common. These are our motor neurons. Here's our cell body, many branches. 1 axon, remember axons are longer, and then many dendrites. Dendrites are shorter. So again, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 branches off of this one. So many branches off the cell body. Bipolar, again, these are pretty rare, found mainly in the sensory receptors in your nose as well as in your retina. Again, bi for 2, there are 2 processes or branches off the cell body. 1, 2. This one is the dendrite, it's shorter, and this one is the axon, it's longer. And then the unipolar or pseudo-unipolar, again, uni means 1. So 1 branch off the cell body, here's the cell body, there's the 1 branch, and then it divides into 2. You have an axon here and some dendrites here. And then here's our anaxonic. Notice that there's no axon at all. It just has many dendrites. Again, dendrites are short. So again, these are found mainly in the brain, some in the retina. These are pretty rare, found in the retina and the sensory receptors in your nose. And most of our sensory receptors are these, the unipolar. And our motor neurons are these, multipolar. Okay, now we're going to look at the glial cells. Remember, the glial cells are the supporting cells. We have different types of glial cells in the central nervous system as compared to the peripheral nervous system. So we're going to look at the glial cells in the central nervous system first. The first type of glial cell in the central nervous system that we're going to look at are the astrocytes. Astro for star, like astronomy. They are star-shaped. Okay, so this is them here. They have foot processes that cover the surface of the neurons, as well as blood vessels and pia matter. Why? Well, they're forming a supportive network. They actually do a very important thing. They help to regulate the composition of the brain fluid, the fluid that circulates around your brain and spinal cord. Uh, and how they do this is they release chemicals that promote the formation of tight junctions. We call these tight junctions a permeability barrier. What this means is that they are able to allow needed things in, such as oxygen, nutrients, and things out that we need to get out, like waste. But then they can keep other things from getting in, like parasites and pathogens and things like that. So we call this the blood-brain barrier. There's permeability barrier that is formed by these astrocytes releasing chemicals that promote the formation of tight junctions. This permeability barrier is called the blood-brain barrier. It determines what substances can pass from the blood into the brain and spinal cord. And you guys, this is one reason why it's really hard to deliver medication to the brain and spinal cord, because this blood-brain barrier, it allows things like oxygen and nutrients in, but prevents unwanted things from getting in. So not only does it prevent things from like parasites and pathogens from getting in and poisons, but it also would prevent medications that we might want to get in from getting in. So it's kind of hard to deliver medicine to the brain and spinal cord for that reason. And this is very important. Your blood-brain barrier is very important to keep. It helps to protect your brain and spinal cord from things that don't need to be getting into it. The next type of a glial cell in the central nervous system are called ependymal cells. These cells line the ventricles, which are cavities or empty spaces inside your brain, and they also line the central canal inside the spinal cord. And we'll talk more about the brain and spinal cord and the ventricles and the central canal later. But anyway, there's an empty space inside your spinal cord. There's also empty spaces within your brain called ventricles, and these cells line those. And what they're doing is they are forming something that we call the choroid plexus, which is inside the ventricles of the brain. And then again, they are lining inside the central canal of the spinal cord. And all of these cells are secreting CSF, which is cerebrospinal fluid. These cells also have cilia. So not only are they secreting CSF, but they're also helping to circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. The cilia help to move the fluid through the cavities in the brain. So you guys, your cerebrospinal fluid actually circulates within your brain and spinal cord as well as around your brain and spinal cord. And it's the cilia in these ependymal cells that help to circulate that cerebrospinal fluid within your brain and spinal cord as well as around your brain and spinal cord. Now, we can actually have a problem with this circulation, with the production and circulation of CSF that ends up causing what we call hydrocephaly. And basically, if you've ever heard a baby being waterhead or water brain or something like that, basically what it is that there's a problem with the circulation of this CSF. And so this CSF builds up around the brain and spinal cord, and it actually puts pressure on the brain and causes brain damage and death. And so if a baby is born with problems with the circulation of this CSF, then they actually would do a shunt, which means that they would run a tube from the baby's from outside, the baby's skull down to the stomach, and that tube would help to drain off excess CSF to prevent the buildup of it on the baby's brain and cause damage to the brain. And end up causing death. The shunt helps prevent that. But these are the cells that are secreting the CSF, and the cilia of these cells are what circulate the CSF. Okay, another glial cell in the central nervous system is called microglia. These are central nervous system specific immune cells that are macrophages. So these are immune cells that are only in our central nervous system, and they are phagocytes. Okay, they gobble up, they engulf, they eat dead tissue, microorganisms, anything that gets through that blood-brain barrier that's not supposed to be there, they will eat it up. And then the last type of glial cell that we're talking about that is part of the central nervous system are called oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes are the specific cells that are forming the myelin sheath around the axons. When it comes to oligodendrocytes, they can form myelin sheaths around multiple neurons. So here's an oligodendrocyte, and you can see how it is wrapped three axons here in myelin. So that is going to be in contrast to the cell in the peripheral nervous system that produces the myelin sheath, okay? So in the central nervous system, the oligodendrocytes produce the myelin sheath, and they can form a myelin sheath around multiple neurons. Remember that. Okay, now we're going to look at the two types of glial cells that we have in the peripheral nervous system. The first one is the Schwann cell. Schwann cells are the cells in the peripheral nervous system that produce the myelin sheath. The difference between oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells. First of all, oligodendrocytes are in the central nervous system. Schwann cells are in the peripheral nervous system. Second of all, oligodendrocytes can produce myelin sheath around multiple neurons. Okay, so again, they wrap around the neuron or the axon of the neuron and create that myelin sheath. Schwann cells cannot produce myelin sheath around multiple axons of multiple neurons. These Schwann cells wrap around a portion of only one axon, okay, to form that myelin sheath. So rather than wrapping around many axons of many neurons like oligodendrocytes, Schwann cells can wrap around a portion of only one axon of one neuron to form a myelin sheath. The other type of glial cells of the peripheral nervous system are called satellite cells. Again, don't get these confused with the satellite cells that fuse to make up skeletal muscle cells. That's not what we're talking about here. These satellite cells are neurons. They are neuroglia, I should say. They are nerve cells in the peripheral nervous system. And they nourish the cell bodies of the neurons. They protect the neurons from heavy metal poisoning. So in a way, they kind of have the function of the microglia in that they're kind of helping to protect, such as from heavy metal poisoning. So to me, they kind of have the function of both those astrocytes and the microglia. Remember, the microglia are the macrophages, the immune cells that are gobbling up pathogens and things that aren't supposed to be there. And then the astrocytes are helping to form that blood-brain barrier that lets needed things in but keeps unwanted things out. So the satellite cells are kind of doing that in terms of protecting the neurons. Keeping things away that don't need to be getting into the cell, or getting rid of them somehow. Okay, so now we're going to look at myelinated versus unmyelinated axons. We actually have some neurons that have what we call myelinated axons, other neurons that have what we call unmyelinated axons. So let's look at the difference between those two. Myelinated axons are axons that are part of neurons that have myelin on them. And again, this myelin is formed by Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system or formed by those oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system. Again, myelin, remember, is a fatty insulation. It is made of phospholipids, and it actually gives the axon, it gives the neuron a white appearance. So these neurons, these myelinated axons, these myelinated neurons form white matter, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And again, this myelin protects and insulates the axons and helps to speed the transmission of action potentials. It also can help to repair axons. And this is what I talked about earlier, those nodes of Ranvier. The myelin on the axon is not continuous. There are gaps in the myelin sheath that we call nodes of Ranvier. And we will talk about how those are important in making the transmission of the action potential faster a little bit later on. We'll talk about saltatory conduction a little bit later. So that will be like tomorrow or Wednesday. I'm not sure which day it will be. Basically, by the time you are a year old, your myelin sheaths are completely developed around your neurons. And degeneration of these sheaths can actually result in slowed action potentials and can impair your ability to control skeletal muscle as well as smooth muscles. So we talked about this, I think, in Regular Anatomy. We actually watched that movie Lorenzo's Oil, where his myelin sheath was degenerating due to the buildup of long-chain fatty acids in his myelin. Other diseases that are going to mimic the symptoms of that ALD that Lorenzo had, multiple sclerosis, and also some cases of diabetes can cause this to happen. Okay, now let's look at unmyelinated axons. Unmyelinated axons, these neurons do not not have any myelin. They are not devoid of myelin. They do have myelin. However, they don't have as much. Okay, basically, what these remember these Schwann cells and these oligodendrocytes wrap around the neuron, the axon of the neuron, to form the myelin sheath. So it's like the cell membrane. This is why it's phospholipids. The cell membrane. The cell is wrapping around the axon, forming the myelin sheath. Well, these do not have any Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes wrapped around them. Rather, these neurons rest in invaginations, in folds in the Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes. So they don't have myelin, they don't have the cells wrapped around them. They are just kind of resting down in grooves and folds in the Schwann cell or the oligodendrocyte. So they do have some myelin, like around part of them, but not all the way around them. And so these are not going to be white. These are going to be darker, and so these are what make up our gray matter in our brain and spinal cord, and we'll look more at that in just a second. So here we see a myelinated axon. You can see here we have Schwann cells wrapped around this myelin. We can see there's many layers here. See how there's many layers of this purple? Okay, that is the myelin, and then this is the Schwann cell that's secreting that. Okay, so that's a myelinated. The Schwann cell is wrapped around, secreting many layers of myelin sheath. Okay, here we have our unmyelinated. Here's a Schwann cell, and then resting down in grooves of that Schwann cell, we see here's an axon. Okay, that axon, it has some myelin around it here, but not many layers, just one layer, and then here it has none. So they're called unmyelinated, but it's not that they don't have any myelin. It's just that they're kind of laying down in canals or grooves. And so they do have some myelin around them, but maybe not completely around them, and definitely not many layers. Okay, and so these myelinated axons, these neurons form white matter in your brain and spinal cord, and these unmyelinated axons of these neurons form what we call gray matter in our brain and spinal cord. So again, gray matter contains unmyelinated axons. It's going to have not very much myelin at all. It's going to be dark in appearance. And so this type of matter in our brain and spinal cord does that integrative function. It, processes the signals that are coming in from the sensory neurons and decides what the response should be. White matter contains myelinated axons, and these are the ones that propagate action potentials. This is the matter that sends action potentials, nerve signals from one area of our brain and spinal cord to another. And what's interesting, in your brain, gray matter is on the outside as well as way down deep, with white matter in the middle. And then in your spinal cord, white matter is on the outside and gray matter is down deeper. The gray matter down in the center of the brain are called nuclei, and these nuclei are just clusters of gray matter that are deep down within the white matter of the brain. And then the gray matter in the peripheral nervous system actually is grouped into neuron cell bodies called a ganglia. So if we look at a picture here, we can see here's our brain, and you can see how the gray matter is on the inside and then way down deep in the middle, and mainly the gray matter is on the outside with white matter inside. And it's just the opposite in the spinal cord. You have the gray matter on the inside with the white matter on the outside. And you can see, and we'll look at this more later, how that gray matter forms almost a butterfly shape inside of the spinal cord, whereas we have that white matter forming, I guess, more of a roughly butterfly shape in the brain, with a little bit of gray matter there in the deep down as well. Okay, so that is all we're going to talk about today. When you have finished watching this video, don't forget to do the exit slip over this part of chapter 11. I hope you have a good day, and we'll be talking to you more tomorrow. Bye-bye.